you could affirm somebody who is mostly otherwise normal, and you're not going to be creating a bigger problem. Whereas if you do this affirmation and things like that, all you're doing for somebody who is like really seriously disordered is feeding the hole in them and like making it larger and having like all of the energy kind of like, get sucked into this black hole.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. Joining me today from Arizona for the fourth time is newly licensed therapist Katie Kernodle, and I'm so excited for our talk. Welcome, Katie.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So our talk today is going to center around humanistic psychology and humanistic therapy. And I feel like that's something that when you learn about it in the textbook, it's so innocuous and innocent sounding that it's like too boring. I wouldn't want to do that as therapy because like it's too boring. But you have a different take on that. So tell me a little bit about your perspective.
Yeah, so like most people, when I first started learning about therapy and counseling, when I first started grad school, I was mostly introduced at a very surface level of what person-centered and like the humanistic wave of counseling means. So as a general rule, people kind of consider it to be the third wave in counseling. So you have the first one of like the Freudians and psychoanalysis and stuff like that. And then the second wave would be the behaviorists. And then the third wave, the like humanistic approach is kind of like in reaction to these two approaches. So for a lot of people who feel like either a Freudian or like a Skinnerian kind of approach aren't adequate, they look at the humanistic perspective and I think they hear like a more holistic perspective of man, taking man as like individually sacred, that kind of thing. So I think that's kind of like the bait that gets people. I'm wondering, like, from your studies, kind of how you were introduced to person-centered and humanistic approaches.
So, I mean, like you said, it was a very shallow understanding of it in the beginning of, client-centered, person-centered, unconditional positive regard, like having like basically limitless optimism that the client has the capacity to change, like some things that when you hear, like when you read like a paragraph of it, that sounds like pretty good. And then we watched the Gloria tapes where Carl Rogers himself actually did like a kind of a real counseling session. So watching the Gloria tapes, it just, he seemed like the most boring one, where he's just kind of, yes, how does it make you feel? Like it seems like the most shallow one to me, I guess.
Yeah, so how would you kind of characterize, for example, unconditional positive regard? That's a big one, so we'll start with that.
Um, I had to kind of twist that one around in my mind for a while because I work in addiction treatment. And it's good to believe in the capacity of the client to change. But I feel like it's very dangerous from my perspective to assume that the client has all the right answers. Like a lot of my clients, their solution to their problems is I want to do heroin. And, so you have to have some kind of confrontation, some degree of confrontation in the work that I do. Whereas I don't know if there's room for that in kind of a Rogerian approach.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think most people, when they hear unconditional positive regard, they're hearing like meeting somebody where they're at. So, not
Yeah.
imposing what like you want them to be or what they quote unquote should be, but just accepting them for who they are, which I think that's the same Mott. I always get Mott and Bailey confused, but I'm pretty sure Mott is the higher one. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so
The
that would be
Bailey's
the
the
same.
field.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
The less defensible lower level would be the Bailey, which is like what unconditional positive regard in like the truest sense means. Because like for someone like Carl Rogers, who was thoroughly involved in like the human potential movement and things like that, they truly believe at a level that I think is difficult for like sane people to understand, that like if you just like totally unconditional support, like perfect, like basically being a substitute for a perfect parent, that kind of thing. And like by perfect, I mean like just like unconditional, always loving, that kind of thing. So not necessarily perfect in like a meaningful sense, but just like a very specific kind of taking the reins off and just letting people go. And like the way that they see it, the natural tendency is going to be positive and like forward moving and I guess like the language that they would use would be actualizing, like
Hmm.
self-actualizing and things like that. And like I mean I think just like in addiction treatment and just in interactions with people in general, I think we can kind of understand that that's more or less falsified by reality.
Yeah.
So like for example, I'm thinking of like I know you're a Christian, so the doctrine of original sin. Like I think having that understanding is really important because otherwise we're left with this idea that just kind of like giving people a little openness and a little shove, and they're just going to magically end up in a positive like orientation. It's kind of like a utopian perspective. Um, I did like so Abraham Maslow, the
I was about to bring up Maslow.
yeah.
Yes.
I don't know why I'm blanking on the triangle. What am I thinking of
Maslow's
again?
hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, hierarchy of needs. So was that something that you were introduced to in your program?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And is it kind of
No,
taken as more or less
it's
the gospel?
it seems like the way it was presented is one, it's uncontrovertible science, and two, it's just like so like basic common sense, and it was just kind of presented to you as like no one would question this.
Yeah, so like the first thing that comes to mind is how higher level like meaning and purpose and things like that are very much accessible by people who don't have their lower needs met. I think we saw that in the concentration camps with Viktor Frankl. I think meaning is the one thing that's accessible at every level and that you can and make those choices even when your lower order needs aren't being fulfilled up to the point of death. And I think that's a really difficult thing for people to grasp. So it is, I find it very like insidious that they present it in this way that is just like kind of obvious when I'm not so sure that that's an accurate characterization of the world. And then I'm also thinking, for example, of Abraham Maslow's relationship to I don't know how familiar you are with Margaret Mead. She's the
Is that like
she dressed like
eugenics?
a I'm sorry, what'd you say?
No, no, never. Go ahead.
She's the one that dressed like a witch basically. She wore like a cape and had a staff and was kind of like cosplaying as like a wizard. Yeah. So she's like a fairly prominent anthropologist. So this is in like the
Oh, that's right. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, like early 20th century. I'm thinking, I guess it's Columbia University, so Franz Boas. So it was
yeah.
Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, who Margaret Mead was very clear that Ruth Benedict had some serious like depression issues and things like that. So they seem like very troubled people. Both of them were basically mentors of Abraham Maslow. So that's kind of why I bring that up because it's like a direct line. So part
Mm,
of what Maslow, when he was like identifying these self-actualized persons, he part of it he modeled on Ruth Benedict, who I mean I think was plainly unwell. So I think it's interesting to me when they talk about self-actualization and like pursuing your highest potential and things like that. That like in his mind, he had a very unwell person that he was thinking of, and like other people that were experiencing quote peak experiences. So like things that made them, I think in their mind, like superior to other people. So like, you know, people that are above normal. But yeah, so like I think that's really important to understand is just like kind of that background and that history, but also just like in an empirical sense. So like that you can have meaning and purpose and things like that without like necessarily having your lower order needs met. And I'm also thinking, for example, of how many woke therapists use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to basically like um, say like, okay, well, we need housing and they need food and they need this and that's why they're not well. And so like that's why we have to go do activism because otherwise they can't like reach their highest potential. I don't know if you noticed that.
You know, it's funny. I'm in my internship class right now, and it's basically all the class is you every 2 weeks you meet and discuss your caseload and you know any tough cases that you have. And our final assignment that we have to do for our last class, which is this coming Monday, is to talk about like the Trump administration's attack on the unhoused. It's like, you know, like what does that have to do with counseling, you know, but that's true of a lot of these types of things. And I'm thinking with Maslow and Rogers, there, and really a lot of like psychology, is this concept of the perfectibility of human beings. Kind of going back to like a Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like if we remove all of this oppressive society, the natural state of man, the natural state of human is this flourishing, you know, perfect creature, essentially, the noble savage. I think that's what Skinner was getting at. I don't know if you heard of Walden 2, but it's this kind of vision for like a behaviorist communist society, basically, where like every behavior is controlled and people are perfect because of that. But it's actually like really creepy when you read it. And I think that's the same way with like Rogers and Maslow. Like if we create like the perfect conditions of society, people will be like perfectly actualized, the perfect human.
Yeah, and I think this circles back to what we talked about in a prior episode, where like communists like truly believe that you are created by either your economic or your social, cultural circumstances. So if you were to create the circumstances where people have all of their needs met, which I don't necessarily think is feasible, like literally, like in all of the physical needs and things like that. But if you were to create the circumstances, then they truly believe with like the right behavioral modification and like, I mean, more or less grooming, that people will, come to this communist consciousness and like be changed in like a meaningful ontological sense. I had never heard of what you mentioned with this the Skinner thing. It makes me think of something called eusychia, which is a Maslow idea. Part of his like like it was his industrial psychology work, which is kind of interesting, but it was kind of like this vision of a world of everyone that being like fully actualized and kind of like what you were describing, like a communist utopia.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've heard of that term eusychia before. I couldn't place it though, but that's really interesting. So how does this like explain kind of how this fits into therapy or how it's being forced to fit into therapy?
Yeah, so this is important to me because I think we haven't fully come to terms with like the seriousness of these practices. So, I mean, we've had at least 50, I guess at this point, probably 75 years of humanistic practices. And we've kind of witnessed, I'd say like a pretty catastrophic turn for society. Because it's more than just like in the process of therapy. This is where like therapy becomes therapy culture and it starts going beyond just like the therapy room and it turns into, the language, the overall culture, the way people look at mental health and like psychology and just like themselves and potential and things like that. And I also think, like in the specific context of therapy, it becomes very dangerous, particularly with like certain populations, or like I'm thinking, for example, of like encounter groups or like certain rehab or like inpatient settings where I think the 60s and 70s, especially in California, this showed to be unbelievably destructive and like extremely dangerous to people. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of that stuff. Like have you ever heard of for example like the Center for Feeling Therapy or anything like that?
No, I haven't heard of that one. Did you in your research come across Synanon?
Oh gosh.
That's an interesting one too. Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
God. Yeah. So I think like the official term for synonym was tender loving care, which is just like an immediate really really creepy.
That's a red
Um
flag.
Yeah, so it was started, as far as I understand, as a drug rehab, if I'm correct there, and then it turned into like one of those weird therapy communities,
Or you
like a
couldn't leave.
cult. Yeah, and they had, I think they called it attack therapy. So, they were like real, like basically group therapy. It reminds me very much of Maoism, where it's like very intense and
Yes, the
aggressive.
struggle sessions.
Yeah,
That's like that was like
so.
a core of Synanon. Yeah.
And like for example, doing a lot of humiliation rituals, like cutting people's hair, things like that. So all of this is happening under the framework of like, the quote unquote human potential movement. So I don't think there's a way to uncouple like true person-centered practice and a lot of these like very formally humanistic psychological ideas from I think like the empirical outcomes that we saw there. Another one that I'm thinking of is Esalen, which is still in I think it's in La Jolla, maybe somewhere in California, but they've got like, nudist hot tubs and things like that. And it's considered fairly prominent. It has a lot of big names associated with it. And like you can go to trainings there, or like self-help or like personal
It's still
development kinds of
around?
things. Yeah, it still is. Still fully active. Yeah, you can still go to the nudist hot tub. Um, and another one that comes to mind, and this one's really prominent, is the Center for Feeling Therapy. And I actually wrote this one down. Are you familiar with Arthur Yanov? So that would be primal therapy.
I don't think so.
Okay, so that's the like the primal scream. I think that's where that comes from. So it's like trying to make people work through the aggression to get them on the other side, that kind of thing, but like from a
Hmm.
very like human potential perfectibility of man kind of perspective.
Yeah.
So basically there was like some sort of internal split with Yanov and his proteges, and a couple of them broke off and created the Center for Feeling Therapy. And this is probably one of the biggest scandals in the history of psychology. It kind of blows my mind that like we're not, I think that we should be taught about these things. I think one of like part of what I'm trying to bring attention here and talking about this is that most therapists are not aware and as a result could be participating in things that they otherwise would not want to participate in. So it was, I mean, one of those extreme cases of cult stuff. So we're talking physical and psychological abuse, humiliation rituals. Like one case included a woman who was deemed by the group to be overweight and was told to moo like a cow and like graze on the ground and that kind of thing. They had a therapeutic technique called slugging, where like the therapist would literally just go up and like punch their client in the face, like literally. So we're yeah.
Wait,
So
is this
just
still
absolute
around?
no, thank God. So this, but like that, so this was by two California licensed psychologists. It had all of the credentials and like the appearance of authority and things like that to lure people into um, like a group that they like a cult that they otherwise wouldn't have ended up in. They were splitting couples apart, splitting families apart, forcing women to have abortions. I mean, it was just brutal. And I have a quote from Carl Rogers who like endorsed this particular center, and I think people should be
Wait, hold
aware
on.
of it.
Before you read that, what time frame is this?
So this would be 1971, and then they were finally shut down in 1980.
Wow, that's wild. I study this stuff a lot. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's among the most significant scandals in the history of psychology. So this was thoroughly endorsed by Carl Rogers. Quote, a group of very honest young therapists tell, with great candor and openness, about the new kind of therapy they are developing and the mutuality of relationships it involves. So this is how Carl Rogers either like was baited into whatever the marketing was, or more or less lacked the discernment to see what was happening there. So that is his comments on this like very, very serious and dangerous cult that was like quite literally punching clients in the face. Um, Another one is the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary scandal. I don't, is that one you're familiar with?
Never heard of that one either.
Okay, it's also wild. So this one was a pilot study. So it was an encounter group pilot study. So I guess it would help for those that aren't aware of what like T groups and encounter groups are. So like, was that something that you guys had to do in your group therapy training? Was like T groups and encounter
Wait, what is
groups?
what is T group?
I think T group stands for training group.
I'm not sure. I don't that doesn't sound familiar.
Okay, so I mean, this is usually considered part of like group therapy training. So this was part of our training at least. So T groups, they come from the National Training Laboratories, which curiously was created by the Office of Naval Research and the National Education Association. So I think the original theorist was Kurt Lewin, who was Jacob Moreno's protege. Jacob Moreno is like big on psychodrama, I think.
Yeah.
But so like they're basically those encounter groups. So um sitting in a circle, this is like a big thing for Carl Rogers, like, the human potential movement in general, was like sitting in a circle and doing group therapy, talking about controversial subjects. I think it got into a lot of like businesses and corporations and things like that through diversity training and like sexual harassment training and things like that. But it's basically like the origin is through the National Training Laboratories and the NEA. And So this particular case of the Sisters of Immaculate Heart of Mary is a it was a pilot study for encounter groups at a basically a nunnery in Los Angeles. And this was in the post Vatican II era where they were like a little bit more open to trying new things and like the spirit of the times and things like that. So I think that coincided with this to where like a Catholic nunnery would be open to humanistic psychology. And so it was a pilot study by Carl Rogers and his protege William Colson. And I'll note at the end here that Colson repented of what he participated in here and ended up being like a very large or a very prominent voice against humanistic psychology and like some of the ideas underlying it. But it started in the mid to late 60s, I think. And I mean, within a year and a half, the order had collapsed. So they started doing these encounter groups and these tea groups and encouraging people to, live in the moment, like basically everything that we kind of understand to be foundational for this American existentialism and this humanistic psychology. It's like living in the moment, like focusing on your feelings, being like very inward and self-focused, frankly, like I would say narcissistic, um, and basically like uncovering who you are within in that Rousseauian sense that you were talking about. So like the idea that there's some sort of noble savage that civilization is on top of, and so if you can just remove civilization, then you can uncover this like truer person that's underneath. And in doing that, within a year and a half, this nunnery had collapsed. A lot of the women were having sex with one another, so like experiencing, as one would expect, like severe guilt and things like that, and not knowing what to do with it, not having a priest to be able to kind of tell them and give them guidance and things like that. And I mean, basically, by the end of a couple years, it had completely collapsed. And Colson, who was Roger's protege, basically repented of what he had done. So he takes accountability for the fact that those encounter groups are what broke up the nunnery, and kind of reflects more on how he got baited into humanistic psychology and like the errors that it has. As far as I understand, I think he is himself a Catholic. But I think this relates a lot to what we were talking about earlier, and I think you could offer like a really good perspective on this being a Christian, is that it presents the human person as like a whole, unified body and soul, that kind of thing. And like each individual is precious in the eyes of God. So I think a lot of people, especially Catholics, were seeing that, comparing it to Freud and B.F. Skinner, and thinking that this is like a more holistic or like a better way of looking at the human person. So I'm wondering, like, especially if you spend time around like other Christian therapists or you think about therapy like specifically from a Christian perspective, if you see that kind of theme echoed and maybe like a little bit of an alignment with what people think is human or humanistic or person-centered approaches.
Yeah, definitely. I've said a number of times on here that two groups that are uniquely vulnerable to being hijacked by wokeness are therapists and Christians. Because with both of those groups, they highly prize empathy, right? And that empathy can be twisted in very dangerous directions. And I think you do see this with a lot of Christian therapists who get swept up in, yeah, like that unconditional positive regard, and almost like, I guess like the worst version of like turning it into a business is like customers always right mentality, but like that like unlimited optimism in the client even when that's misplaced. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I also want to get your thoughts on just like the lack of engagement or contention with the nature of evil, because I think that's a really important part of Christianity is just engaging with the fact that there is evil in the world. I know there's like debates about whether evil is a privation of the good or if it like has an ontological substance, whatever. Like I like besides that kind of stuff, I'm wondering if you notice the lack of engagement with evil. And I think about this in our field in general, that like by and large, we are a very person-centered field. I think Carl Rogers is the father of counseling. And
Mm.
what that means for our ability to either like I mean even accept the reality of evil or identify it, including in our own myths, because we are, I mean, in a pretty serious collapse related to a complete takeover by Marxists. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Wait, could you rephrase the question? I think I missed it.
Yeah, just like what does it mean to not take evil seriously and
Gotcha.
how that impacts like our discernment?
I think it kind of comes back to that, like always seeing like the best decline in the best light. Like in the work that I do in this population, I've met a number of psychopaths, like antisocial personality, a lot of narcissism, cluster B type stuff. You see that on a regular basis. And I feel like if you spend time in this population, you probably aren't in any delusion that like humans are perfect angels, right? Like you see the darker side of things. And I feel like some therapists, particularly ones who work with like what you call the worried well, might have somebody who's like pretty materially comfortable, their life isn't all that bad, but maybe they have a little bit of anxiety or something. It's easy to see like the positive side of things and ignore a lot of the evil, like you were saying. Um, and I think when you start to get in that rhythm, in that pattern, you can ignore like, a client who's abusing their spouse, or, a client who's, acting unethically at work. Like there's all kinds of things that you can ignore because you should take the client's word for everything and assume that, they're an angel essentially.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, for example, too, of affirmation and like what affirmation means for somebody who is mostly normal, or like you said, the quote unquote worried well, versus somebody who has very serious psychological issues. So, like, say somebody is having a difficult time, and you like reinforce positive things or like you affirm things like that. It's a completely different thing for somebody who is more or less psychologically sound versus somebody who is experiencing a personality disorder and the hole that you're trying to fill is, I mean, I think of it kind of like a black hole, and I got this from James Lindsay in a podcast, but like there are just regular holes and they're like psychological black holes. So like if as you add more to a black hole, it just keeps getting bigger. And I
Mm.
think this makes sense for the context of things like personality disorders, because like you could affirm somebody who is mostly otherwise normal and you're not going to be creating a bigger problem. Whereas if you do this affirmation and things like that, all you're doing for somebody who is like really seriously disordered is feeding the hole in them and like making it larger and having like all of the energy kind of like, get sucked into this black hole. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I was going to go a little bit different direction. Gosh, this is probably 7 or 8 years ago. I was pretty depressed, pretty overweight, not feeling really good about myself. And I looked for a therapist who specialized in nutrition because I wanted to lose some weight and like feel better. And I thought that would kind of help me on my journey. And I sat down with her for one session, and she kept saying like, you don't need to worry about what you eat. You don't need to worry about anything about how you look, anything like that. All you need to do is like love yourself because you're perfect just the way you are. And I kept being like, I feel terrible. Like I feel awful all the time. I can't get a date. Like things that I love to do, like hiking, I get worn out after 10 steps. And she kept like dismissing all that thing because all she could see is like, you're perfect just the way you are. Where I came into therapy, like wanting to make a change. And I think that like, from that perspective, that I think that was really frustrating.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I'm thinking now as a Christian, how you like what would be an alternative way of kind of approaching that situation.
Yeah. I mean, um, I feel like being a Christian, there's like kind of this dual nature that you're always wrestling with. Like that humans have the capacity for good and the capacity for evil. So we're created in the image of God on one hand, but we're also fallen, with this original sin on the other hand. And you can be pulled in either direction, and kind of being very deliberate about which one of those that you feed into. Um, and I think, gosh, there's so much, like particularly in the book of Proverbs, about your habits and your routines, and making your path straight by like those little actions you take. And I feel like that could be so valuable in therapy if you were to kind of apply some of that wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. I truly think the antidote for so much of this stuff is found in Christianity and like truly biblical Christianity. So it's really helpful to be able to get your perspective on that. Um, I think the lack of contention with evil is not only like an issue in like our actual practice with individual clients and whether or not we're able to accurately see them, accurately diagnose, and accurately like give them the treatment that they need. But also just in our ability to self-police and manage our own field. So, by and large, we are completely taken over by Marxists. I mean, basically from the top level, and it's in our ethics, it's in our standards, it's in our curriculum, it's in all of these different things. And yet people somehow don't see it. And so I've had to sit for the past few years really trying to figure out why is it that so many people can be in this field and not see like the tremendous evil that's going on right in front of our faces. And so yeah, like is that something you've kind of engaged with?
I think that a big part of it is how it's so easy for us to identify evil that comes from like fascism. We're so primed, I think, with how we study history, first of all, but just second of all, it's just like it naturally seems, I think, repulsive to a lot of people. And so if you were to say something like, I want to create a white ethno state, then like there's alarm bells going off in everyone's head. Like we just instantly, like in half a second, I've already identified that that's evil, right? But with Marxism, it's a more difficult evil to identify, right? Because you use a lot of coded language, a lot of pseudo empathetic language. And I think, again, something about therapy and psychology are just vulnerable to getting sucked into this and just completely missing the evil that's right behind this very thin veil. It's wild that there's been so many cults coming out of psychology and therapy and all this stuff. I can't name any cult that comes from lawyers or doctors or engineers, but for some reason our field, just like we're just prone to cults.
Mhm. I think that's true. I think, I mean, now that you mentioned that, I think it's a good segue to talking maybe a little bit about the relationship to this and fascism, because I think that's what kind of initially prompted even talk like having this discussion publicly is because I have been fairly open about the fact that I think that all of this like humanistic psychology and this kind of like Rogerian um, ethos is heading directly into like real fascism. And I think that making that connection is very difficult for people. So if you're comfortable with it, I can continue to talk about that.
100%. Please do.
Yeah. So I think it's easy for people to forget that prior to like the collapse into Nazi Germany, you had like the very decadent libertine, so like not liberal, but like a libertine Weimar Republic that was very self-involved, very interested in like immediate pleasures and things like that. And it created like the societal black hole basically that led to the rise of fascism. So, when you create that hole, people start craving more stability, and more like
Order.
I think it creates, yeah, like more order and things like that, even if it has to be imposed. So part of like how Weimar Germany got to where it was through like a long history of 19th century and like I mean even prior to that, like this German romantic and idealist intellectual tradition. So, I'm thinking of like I mean German and French really, but like Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, all of that, and like like Humboldt, things like that. And it like a huge part of education, and I'm actually going to use this as an opportunity to plug this book, which is Hitler and the Germans by Eric Voegelin, which I highly recommend. And this is how I've learned a lot about this stuff. But it was a particular form of education called Bildung, which is basically like a holistic self-development, whole life education. Honestly, it reminds me very much of social emotional learning and like whole child education, whole person education. But it's built on this very romantic, idealist conception of man as perfectible, heading towards, like self-actualizing and towards an ideal. And it has so many parallels in my mind to what like humanistic psychology and like this person-centered anthropology and like approach to the person in education kind of bring. And because of that, I feel like a very deep obligation to take that seriously and I understand that like it's very controversial to consider that like someone like Carl Rogers, who was probably fairly well-meaning, or Abraham Maslow, and this legacy that a lot of otherwise, well-meaning and good people are participating in, could inadvertently create the societal conditions for like a fascist reaction. So yeah, does that relate to you, or what are you thinking there?
I'm trying to unpack. 'Cause I remember, I don't know if you've read, I'm sure you have, Abigail Schreier's Bad Therapy. Yeah,
Yeah.
she teases out, but she didn't go too deep with this about, Maslow and Rogers kind of being, uh how would be an accurate way to say it, kind of like a Trojan horse for Marxism, maybe, I think is how she kind of presents it in a sense. And so I'm trying to unpack what you're saying. And um, earlier you used the word narcissistic, and like this kind of excessive rumination of like, how do I feel? What are my feelings? Like I need to explore my identity. Like a lot of this trans stuff is extremely navel gazing, but it's true of just like a lot of therapy culture in general, just completely inward turning, obsessive about myself. And it's easy to see how like you kind of lose any like coherent sense of community with that hyper individualism, and open the door for like a fascist, I'm going to bring order to things. I mean that's fascinating.
Yeah, like as you describe it, the closing off and the inward thing, I think gives a really good visual. So one of the things that Eric Voegelin does is compare this to like more of like a platonic self-transcendence. So like if you compare like a platonic self-transcendence and like a turning around, and like a like turning around towards the good and that kind of thing, or like a Christian repentance, that kind of thing, to um like a narcissistic, entirely enclosed self-development. I think like that's kind of the difference. So like self-transcendence versus self-development. And in doing so, you create people like a bunch of people who are unable to see like what's literally right in front of their face because they're not connected to reality. So it's interesting to me that the term idiots comes from like idiotes, which means private persons in Greek. So
Wow.
yeah, and like that really struck me because like it's not being like it's not like being an idiot in like a intellectual sense. It's like you can be very smart, but it's like lacking, it's like being the fool in like a biblical sense of like lacking the like primary contact with reality and engagement with that in order to be able to like discern good from bad, true from false, that kind of thing.
I'm wondering if you could flesh out, if you see it this way, an interplay between like what we call the woke left and the woke right, where the woke left has encouraged like this almost like completely absurd like Marxism on acid, basically just complete navel gazing, just absurd obsession with identity. And kind of the woke right, a lot of it is bringing back like trad culture. Like I remember like a meme that I see keeps coming up. Some variation of it is, "This is what they took from you," and it'll be like a small town, like small town America, something like that. It's like, can we bring back small town America? Can we bring back the nuclear family? Like, it's kind of this like this very like communal message of like a mythical time past that we've lost, and they seem to be playing off of each other in that sense, and kind of each fueling the other.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So it's that like it's return, but like return with the V. I think people like I can visualize it in
Yes.
my mind.
Yeah,
But like
yeah.
like that fantasy kind of return. I've heard people call the woke right like a kind of postmodern traditionalist. So they hold these like apparent values and things of the past in pastiche, but like not truly in like a substantive way. So it's more like a cosplay. It's like very oriented towards young people who spend a lot of time on the internet, right? Like very influenced by images and things like that. And so I do think there's something there. And I think like what you're bringing up too is like what they took from us, that kind of thing. It plays on like a sense of resentment,
Yeah.
and like a very, I'd say, anti-biblical, like demanding and narcissistic kind of perspective that like you are somehow owed XYZ, and because you don't currently have XYZ, that means that there's something wrong with the world and society and that kind of thing, instead of taking responsibility for like what you can do and try to take responsibility for like your small part in life versus demanding it from other people and from, society and the culture and things like that, like in a top-down kind of sense.
Hmm. Last time you described liberation theology as Marxism and Catholic drag. And I feel like with this woke right stuff, there's a similar idea of taking traditional Christianity and kind of wearing it as a costume. Because a lot of these people are not like, don't have Christianity as a belief, but as like an aesthetic. And so it's like, I kind of want some type of the world that Christianity created without all the same like moral obligations that it brought with it. It's kind of like a lot of baggage. In the same way they want like a lot of the aesthetic of trad culture, but it's like really I want like an Instagram page where I show myself making sourdough bread. Like you don't actually want trad culture. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, yeah, they hold it as an aesthetic, and I think they hold it as a cudgel. Like they see it as like a
Mm.
power tool that you can whack other people over the head with. And I mean, I think it's completely anti-biblical, and I think the message of like in Christianity, God literally descends and empties himself to become a man and redeem people in an entirely unearned act of grace. That is a very different thing than like using Christianity as like a framework to hold over people's heads and like whack them over the head in order to make them do things that you want them to do. So I think that there's like a foundational orientation, like either to reality and accepting reality as is, or demanding what you want reality to be. And I think the woke right is kind of in that latter camp.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I feel like we've seen some version of this play out with like the fascist regimes on the right or the Marxist regimes on the left. But to me, this seems like I was saying earlier, like those things on acid. Like it's like a more absurdist version of what we saw in the 20th century. How do you see either of these playing out?
Yeah, so I think like on acid, the language I would use is hyper real, because we're
Mm.
like in so much of
The
this.
Baudrillard?
Yeah, yeah. So because we're in this really um like technology driven and like social media driven kind of society and things like that, and especially for young people, like the target audience I would say are young people. And so like in terms of how I see this playing out, it's generally not good because you're having a lot of um, young people, especially young men, who are getting sucked into this culture, getting sucked into like the people and place, which is just like a blood and soil kind of thing.
Mm.
You've got people, I mean, on the woke left getting sucked into other forms of ideologies and dangerous practices and doing like self-harming behaviors and things like that. And it like builds a cycle, like a back and forth cycle of resentment, bitterness, that kind of thing, and it just kind of like devolves from there until like you just tear your society apart. And that's what I think like how this all works and why like I take humanistic psychology so seriously because I think it forms um like the spiritual foundation of being closed off, which creates all these like tiny little black holes of people. And then before you know it, at scale and like at a societal and a cultural level, it starts creating a black hole um, in the culture. And before you know it, like your society and everything that you hold dear is completely torn apart and like, sucked into a vacuum. And in that vacuum, you're going to have opportunists and power hungry people take advantage of it and rise to the top. So that's like why I take it so seriously. And frankly, that is how I see it playing out. If we don't um, get a grip on like each individual person orienting to reality and taking responsibility for their circumstances um, and their like mind and cognitive world, if that makes sense. So, like no more resentment, like taking full responsibility for how we feel, how we act, things like that. Those are the things that are going to turn us around. And that's where I think Christianity has such like an integral role to play in restoring the American culture.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I really like all that. I wanna get back to kind of the therapy thing and kind of these pseudo cults that got spun off from I guess Rogerian or humanistic psychology. One of the things that I wanted to point out that I don't know if you have any like knowledge or research you've done on this, but there's like the core of what the cult was that got busted up or whatever. But then a lot of those ideas kind of matriculated out to the broader society and have kind of infiltrated therapy culture. So a lot of the stuff from Synanon, for decades infiltrated drug addiction rehabs. A lot of that attack therapy was a big part of rehabs for a long, like I've just seen like the last ones close that were like that here in Austin, like in the last few years. So like Synanon's impact was decades after they were officially closed. I'm wondering if you see that with some of these other concepts that technically went out of favor. Are some of these ideas like spreading in ways that like people might not necessarily trace back to that origin?
I mean, I think the phenomenon of the struggle session probably comes directly from attack therapy. Most people think of it in the Mao sense, and I think that's appropriate. But like in the very specific American context where it's happening in your little like, in your DEI circles and in your schools and your corporations and things like that, I think there's like a pretty solid precedent for Synanon and like attack therapy and things like that. Um, I'm trying to think of like what else was part of your question. I'm sorry.
That's just kind of the general idea, but we can kind of run with that with the struggle session. It seems like in classrooms, the way they've set up the unspoken rules give a big advantage to the left on a lot of these things because of the way they use language. And so a lot of these struggle sessions, you'll have someone overtly being the aggressor, framing the issue as though they're the victim and you're the aggressor. And it makes it very hard to participate in those type of class discussions or, whatever kind of situation you're in.
Yeah, I think the language I would use is DARVO, like deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender.
Is
Yeah.
that like
So
from
like that's
Narcissus?
yeah, I think so. And that's absolutely, I think, a relevant part of this is that it creates the circumstances for like the most narcissistic and abusive to rise to the top or like dominate everything, and and so nobody else can really do anything about that. I mean, I saw that in my program. I think a lot of people are going to observe that in any circumstance where like the woke have taken over, is that it's going to be whoever is the most adept at playing that particular game is going to rise to the top, and it creates a situation where it's no longer about merit, it's about playing like the Marxist game. But yeah, I mean, I think like for like Rogers and that kind of thing, I mean, that's definitely an education, social emotional learning, a lot of like child-centered education, things like that are very much influenced by these ideas. And I think it's just kind of like an overarching part of our culture at this point. Like when people say therapy culture, I hear humanistic, like human potential, that kind of thing.
That is so fascinating because I feel like there's so many aspects of therapy that have become just matriculated into the broader culture, and a lot of it's been weaponized. So I can shut down your argument by saying like you're toxic, you're gaslighting me, you're a narcissist, all these like therapy language that, particularly people with certain personality disorders are really good at weaponizing that stuff. And so often it's being used as part of this bigger political project.
Yeah, and I mean, iron law of woke projection never misses. So a lot of times, yeah, when people are referring to a lot of other people like in their lives as narcissists and things like that, that there might be something deeper going on there. And why I think like in the context of in the context of therapy, in the context of education, as well as in the culture, that creating the circumstances and the incentive structures and the practices that facilitate that very inward kind of narcissistic, even if it's not like on a full clinical scale, but just like narcissism in general, um, is harming people. I mean, I think we have to take accountability for the fact that like it's a very unpleasant experience to be to have the experience of a narcissist, to be like hypersensitive to criticism, to be very self-conscious and that kind of way, like very fragile. I think, we're causing like real psychological harm, both at like the individual level and at like a broader and like interpersonal and social scale.
Wow. Okay, so this is like painting a pretty gloomy picture of therapy right now. And you are a newly licensed therapist. I'm an intern. Will get licensed here in a few months. What is like a positive outlook for therapy, or like how can we right the ship and start going in the right direction in our profession?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, like obviously there are plenty of professional therapists who are entirely sane and
Mm.
doing sane practices and things like that. And I think the way that therapy is, because it's particularly individual and it's really going to depend person to person, that kind of shields people from like some of these broader trends and things like that. And so, like, of course, there are tons of great therapists doing great work. Um, but I can't ignore the fact that we have a full-on hardcore Marxist takeover to the point where, I mean, we're doing liberation and decolonial practices that are like very explicitly oriented to violence, and that this is all happening pretty openly, and we can't see it. So I think that that has to be accounted for, and we have to consider how we got into this position, and like what we need to be able to have the discernment to prevent that from ever happening again. Because like we do have to like figure out a way of like immunizing therapy from these kinds of like like parasites, basically like taking over and latching on to our profession. And I think part of that involves like taking full accountability for humanistic psychology and like what that has wrought for people.
I know we've covered some of this already, but it's just so bizarre to me that the most oppressive and murderous ideology that humans have ever come up with has infiltrated the profession that's responsible for talking people through their mental health issues. Like, I mean, like we talk about this all the time, but like, you step back for a second, like, how did that happen? I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I think like I truly think, especially in like the context of counseling, where the Rogerian ethos is basically mandatory. Like I truly think that the lack of connection to reality is what prevents us from being able to see and articulate it. It keeps us in our little boxes. You can't really criticize other forms of therapy that are grounded in theory like that. Like that is one of the ACA's like part of the ACA code of ethics is that like you're expected to respect people who are using different theories and things like that. Whereas I think we need to be much more oriented to what is reality, what are like the American founding principles, and how do we adhere to them and practice them and like ensure that we're um, like preventing, like I said, like these parasites from taking over and causing, I mean, tremendous harm to the public.
I like that answer. I like that answer. So my final question that I asked, I've asked you this before. I want to see if there's a different answer, and that is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Oh gosh. So I think when I was asked that last, I mentioned the woke right. And I think that we're increasingly getting to the point that we're talking about the woke right, but I think my answer is kind of the same. Like, and especially like for Christian and maybe more conservative audiences, like this is something that you need to be aware of, particularly if you have like children, teenagers, young people in your life, and like the ways that they might be being misled, especially on the internet and through culture, like down a path that they would otherwise not want to go down. And just being mindful of that, and like for like religious leaders and like older people in churches and things like that, that you can um like this is an opportunity for discipleship that people really need.
Mm. Yeah, one thing I would say to Christians is these people are wolves in sheep's clothing. They're wearing your faith as a costume, and they do not have good intentions.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a level of true evil that I think people really need to come to terms with and use, the full force of everything that they have to battle against.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, completely agree. Well, Katie, thank you so much for this. This was very enlightening. Taught me a lot about humanistic psychology and what is under the surface, because that one or two paragraphs in your textbook makes it sound very innocent, and you gave us a lot more detail. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, where can people find you if you want to be
You can
found?
Yeah, that's totally fine. I online, it's usually the kids are not all right. I'm on Substack at hideyourkids.substack.com, and my handle on Twitter is at hide your kids 0.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. As always, love talking to you.